Hello, everyone. Today we're covering the most transformative decade in the history of the US, which is the Roaring Twenties. But I want to concentrate mostly on the end of the Roaring Twenties and basically how the Roaring Twenties caused the eventual collapse of 1929 with the stock market crash, and then how, the different approaches by President Hoover and President FDR on basically trying to recover from that economic depression, right? So let's get started. All right. So there are a lot of things that make the Roaring Twenties the Roaring Twenties, right? You can go from, the Jazz Age to Prohibition to first wave feminism to, the mass production of the vehicle. There's a lot of components that make the Roaring Twenties, one of the most transformative decades in the history of the US. But we also have what I think is going to have the most impact, or one of the things that is going to have the most impact, which will be the idea of consumerism and eventually leading to the stock market crash of 1929, right? So during this decade, there's a lot of prosperity in the U.S., right? Because we need to understand that the U.S. coming out of World War One became pretty much one of the or the leading nations of the world, right? Massive industry, a lot of infrastructure, better wages, a lot of job opportunities. So there's a lot of prosperity, but also a lot of hope for a kind of sort of like a perpetual wealth, right? So people kind of saw it because you need to understand that World War One is supposed to be the war to end all wars. And so having this enormous prosperity and all this change because there's a lot of new inventions, the refrigerator, the radio, like a lot of home appliances, the telephone, electricity is becoming, it's expanding, it's becoming bigger. So there's a lot of things going on. So it makes sense that there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of, prosperity going on. So among these things is the idea that a lot of Americans have more access to, financial resources, right? There's more people working, there's better wages, and at the end of the day, this is going to fuel a massive consumerism, right? And consumerism is basically this obsession with shopping, all right? And along with consumerism, we also have this idea of buying on credit. Okay, so people had the opportunity to not only have better wages, but also there's new inventions, right? That very soon they're gonna be transformed into necessities, right? The radio, refrigerator, the toaster, the telephone, the phonograph, the car that is not a new invention but is being mass produced. So all of these things, not only is it more accessible and more affordable, you can also buy it on credit, right? So it is kind of like incentivizing a lot of Americans to buy, right? And don't get me started with advertisement, all right? Advertisement exploded during this time, kind of sort of, pushing people to spend, right? So in the 1920s, the economy of the US, as opposed to being based on industry, on the, from the 1910s, that it was a very industrial economy. In the 1920s, the American economy was more centered around, the middle class spending money, right? So the idea of people spending money to buy new things is what fueled the economy, right? Because it created more jobs, it created more wages, it created, more opportunity to access all the different things. So it just became the fuel for the American economy, right? So during this time, this consumerism, this idea of kind of sort of like living beyond your means and buying on credit, and there wasn't a lot of a culture of saving, is what really led to Americans, spending. Okay, so this is also going to cause a lot of the companies to be overproducing, right? Because they need to match basically how much people are demanding all these products. Okay, so the problem is that this cannot be forever, right? And most people envision this thing, to be a perpetual thing, right? This is the way it looks like. Okay, so the reality is that at some point this needs to stop, all right? We cannot keep on this pace forever. Okay, so by the end of the 1920s, the economy is finally slowing down, right? People cannot keep up with this pace of just spending. So one way to understand this is through the vicious cycle, right? So it's basically the idea of when overproduction means underconsumption, right? So it leads to this vicious cycle in which you can understand. like this. If you produce this amount of product, you're gonna need this amount of employees, right? But when overproduction means underconsumption, it basically means that you're only producing this amount, so you're going to need this amount of employees now, right? So that means people are gonna be laid off, right? So how does the vicious cycle work?
And so the vicious cycle works like this. When the economy starts slowing down, people are going to have less money, right? So we start here. We have less money. After people have less money, then people are going to stop buying as much product. And when people stop buying as much products, factories won't be producing as much. And when factories won't be producing as much, there's going to be less employment. And when there is less employment, there is less money. Less money means people don't buy. Less people buying means factories produce less, and so on and so forth, right? So this vicious cycle is going to create a situation that is very difficult to get out of.
So when the market crashes, it's going to create a lot of problems that, people weren't thinking about it, right? Like the idea of this massive unemployment, like the idea of people losing their property, like banks closing down, like, the economy being based on, production and consumption by the people, but not being able to depend on that anymore. And, people being used to some standard of living that they cannot keep up anymore. So there's a lot of issues going on. And here's when you have this idea of, you know, a reimagination of the role of the government. Now, you can try to understand the Great Depression through Hoover, or you can try to understand the Great Depression through FDR. The reality is that neither of them actually fix the economy. The difference between them is one of them is leadership, and two is the redefinition of the role of government. All right. So there's a lot of things that are going to go through FDR and through Hoover that would make this video a little bit too long. What I want to concentrate is basically on the idea of the redefinition of the role of the government, right? Because through Hoover, you're going to see that, for example, Hoover does not believe a lot on government intervention, right? He believes in limited government. He believes in the rugged individualism. He believes in the idea of self-reliance. He believes that, becoming too involved is going to undermine the people's ability to, for self-reliance. Okay, so he doesn't like any of this. When you see images of the Great Depression and you see soup kitchens or bread lines, this is not the government assistance. This is not the government trying to help out the people. If anything, is the government facilitating charities to be able to provide for the people, but the government itself is not helping out the people, all right? Because the idea of Hoover is that he's still a social Darwinist, right? He doesn't believe in the idea of the government intervention, right? This is not the role of the government. This is not what the founding fathers envisioned, right? Now, when you look at FDR, FDR has a very different style of leadership, right? To begin with, FDR is very much a leader, all right? And when you think of FDR's presidency, you need to split his presidency, into the Great Depression and then through World War II, right? So in the Great Depression, FDR does a lot of things, right? He believes the opposite of Hoover. He believes that the government should be there to help out the people, right? There's this redefinition of the role of government, right? Which I believe is one of the main outcomes of the Great Depression, is that we have this new discussion about, you know, what is the role of the government, especially in the times of need, right? If there is a crisis, what is the role of the government? And for Hoover, this basically just meant, the role of the government is basically to, maintaining national security, blah, 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 but not really anything towards the people. It's not there to give you welfare, for example, right? For FDR, it meant the opposite. For FDR, it meant that if the government is not going to be there to support the people, then what is the role of the government, right? If not for that, right? And this is why his first term is called the New Deal, right? It is this new deal between the people and the government, in which the people need to put a lot of trust in the hands of the government so that the government can do a lot of things for the people. And this is a very idea of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that, there's a time of crisis. and the government needs to spring into action, right? So the very famous phrase of FDR, "We need action and action now," you know, is one of his most favorite quotes, most popular quotes. And, this is really the embodiment of what is the role of the government. The government should be there to do everything in its power to help out the people. And so ever since FDR's presidency, we've had this continuous redefinition of the role of government, all right? And, it's always been this idea of how much government is too much government, right? Because if you remember from the Jeffersonian times, we were a very limited government philosophy of the government. And now we became a more like government interventionist, right? Government for everything, right? And this is parting ways with the original intention of the founding fathers, right? So I believe this idea of the Great Depression, one of the main outcomes is this redefinition of the role of government. That we first see it with Hoover, and he still has this mentality of the government shouldn't intervene, you shouldn't meddle too much with people self-reliant, their rugged individualism. And then you have FDR's vision of like, no, like you should be helping out people. The role of the government is going to be the opposite of what Hoover believed, right? So anyways, guys, I just wanted to take this opportunity to use the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and all the different things to explain a little bit of how the roles of the government has been changing. Let me know what you think. My question is always how much government is too much government? Where do you find the balance, right? So it is always a very interesting for them to ask. Let me know what you think, and I'll be around. Okay, be safe.